And welcome back to this special session, the concluding day of the 11th Human Rights Defenders Forum at the Carter Center. Some of you were here last year when, at the conclusion of the forum, President Carter announced that he would write a book that was inspired by the discussion that took place. And he did, no surprise. Titled Faith, A Journey for All, this book explores various forms of faith upon which we rely. Faith in God, faith in families and relationships, faith in the social and governing institutions we have created. Today, we will explore aspects of these ideas and build on the conversations that you've been having in your workshops over the previous days. I think all of you know that when President Carter served as President of the United States, he made a crucial decision to put the full weight and support of his administration behind the United Nations human rights efforts, and particularly the Universal Declaration. He signed the main human rights treaties and helped establish the first ever full-time human rights office within that organization. And as I know, within the US government, he made human rights a key element of United States foreign policy. I was a junior American diplomat at the time, and this made an indelible impression on me. This year, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. President Carter, early on, embraced the totality of the rights enshrined in the document, economic, social, and cultural, as well as political and civil. So the premise of today's discussion is that to restore faith and freedom, we need to broaden our concepts of faith to include a growing confidence in each other and in democracy itself. And we must broaden our ideas of freedom to echo another US president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that freedom from want is equal to the freedom from other forms of tyranny. Your discussions over the past few days and today will help us articulate some of the challenges and opportunities that face us during these especially challenging times. We will begin our meeting with a little inspiration, as usual, in the form of a musical performance by Reginald and Jonathan Colbert, Sean and Khalil Anderson, Elidusa Almeida, and Charles Marvari. This will be followed by a special video message from musical artist Peter Gabriel, who wanted to be here today, but instead sent his expression of solidarity on film. Following the performance and the video, we will ask President Carter to give opening remarks. So here comes the music.
We're going to go. Can you please go ahead and play the video?
Oh, video.
After we're going to do the video first.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, guys.
Hi to everyone at the Carter Center at the Human Rights Defenders Forum. This is Peter Gabriel in London. More than 40 years ago, after I'd written a song about the murder of a young South African leader called Stephen Biko, I got a phone call from Bono and was asked to take part in a US tour for Amnesty. I was profoundly moved by the frontline activists and human rights abuse victims that we met, and I ended up taking on Bono's role as chief hustler for the next and most ambitious Human Rights Now tour that the Amnesty team were beginning to plan around the 40th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. This tour went around the world. It doubled Amnesty's membership and changed the lives of all the musicians who took part, and many who saw the shows. Although there were human rights problems all over the world, we were filled with optimism about the future, about how we were going to act to change things. Free elections were taking place in many societies for the first time, and people really felt more free than ever to express their opinions and to organize around all sorts of issues. It really saddens me that all those years later, we face a profound reversal for human rights, as many have lost faith and trust in the institutions of democracy. We're watching the rise of authoritarian leaders and draconian policies, and immigrants and refugees are treated as flotsam and jetsam. More and more smart people are now using the technology that was introduced to join us together to pull us apart. This dark movement is going after the very core of the idea of human rights. That the world at large and every society benefits and progresses when fundamental human rights, enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are embraced and enjoyed by everyone. That visionary document was adopted at the newly formed United Nations 70 years ago. And we need to take another look at this agreement that all those countries signed. We urgently need to get help out to all the world to protect, champion, and defend all those rights. There are many who believe that human rights are not a luxury, but a basic necessity, that the rights defined in this declaration should really be available to all. During his term as US President, Jimmy Carter signed many human rights treaties, including the Covenant on Civil Political Rights, alongside the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He showed us then, and continues to remind us today, that these are complementary rights, and that every human being must enjoy the right to choose their leaders, just as they have the right to a high-quality education. The right to freedom of conscience is just as urgent as the right to an adequate standard of living, health care, housing, and clean water. Governments really have the duty to create conditions for these rights to be realized, so that the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest grows smaller, not larger, and that any scarce resources are not wasted on destructive endeavors such as excessive and ineffective military adventures. The dangers I face in my life are really few and far between. But being a frontline human rights activist often requires courage, great courage, and your life can be lonely and very scary. I really want to thank all of you gathered here today for what you do and for this amazing movement you're creating. To have a forum like this, where your work is respected and celebrated, in which your dreams and fears can be safely discussed and developed, is really an extraordinary gift. This is a real human rights family, and the mother and father who created this particular family are no less extraordinary than this community they have so often supported and fought for. They've been an inspiration to me for many years. Please join me now in a huge round of applause for President and Mrs. Carter, Jimmy and Rosalind. I salute you and thank you so much for everything you've done and for bringing a truly bright light to a darkening world.
And now we're going to postpone our musical performance and we're going to go straight to the person you've all been waiting to hear from, President Jimmy Carter. Sir.
Okay. Well, as you can see, Peter Gabriel is a good friend of mine. As a matter of fact, one of the things about me that you may not know is that I'm going to be commemorated as a rock and roll president. And they're making a documentary now. I've spent a couple hours talking to them already about it. And so Bob Dylan's going to be talking, and Willie Nelson's going to be talking, Bono's going to be talking, along with Peter Gabriel, about my long time ago, not very long ago, a good friendship with these people. Recently, Bob Dylan was given the award as the outstanding composer of a lifetime. And he refused to accept the award for 2 or 3 years. And then finally he said, well, if Jimmy Carter will come out to Los Angeles and give me the award, I'll accept it. So I went out and enjoyed, took 2 of my sons with me. But he's been a friend of mine since I was the governor of Georgia. And I've been on the stage with Willie Nelson now, I think 6 or 7 times. Sometimes he forgets the lyrics, and I remember the lyrics, but I can't carry a tune. So he always moves the microphone away from my mouth toward his. But anyway, I didn't intend to talk about that. I didn't know that Peter was going to give the major part of my speech in advance. But thank you very much, all of you, for coming. We have some very distinguished guests here, and all of you, in fact, are distinguished. I want to express my gratitude to you. I understand that there are a lot of you coming here from 36 nations in the world, and now for 36 years, it just happens to be the same number, the Carter Center has been emphasizing 2 things, basically: peace and human rights. And we consider peace to be one of the basic human rights. So the umbrella under which the Carter Center has always operated and always will operate, I hope, in the future, is the umbrella of human rights. This was one of the key commitments that I made when I gave my inaugural address as president in ancient times. And we tried to promote human rights as best we could as a nation. Well, I think you know that I've written several books. Some of them have come out of this forum itself. I don't want to blame the forum for my books, but it's the truth. Back in a long time ago, 2003, we had a session here called "The Effect on a Global Basis of the War on Terror Adversely on Human Rights." Because when the United States basically abandoned some of the commitments to the Geneva Conference and to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to so-called protect us from another terror attack after the 2001 event, other countries on earth who had been inclined toward abusing human rights anyway said, well, if the United States no longer believes in human rights and has it as a top commitment, then it'll be okay for us to lower our standards on human rights as well. So we had a special forum on that. And out of that session, as a matter of fact, I wrote a book called Our Endangered Values. That was a time after we had invaded Iraq unnecessarily, based on false premises and statements, and when we started to tighten up on the basic freedoms of America in our own country. So in that book, I wrote about a lot of the real serious concerns that we still face today that I'll get to a little bit later in my remarks. But this was a time when we talked about the division that had arisen in previous years in political affairs, but also in religious affairs. And later, we got out into the discussion in that book about the terrible situation in our prisons and the terrible situation with the overwhelming influence of the gun lobby in America and the inequity in income that had been generated in America. As a matter of fact, that began almost immediately after I left the White House in 1981. The first basic tax law that was passed after I left the White House really overemphasized the well-being of the very rich people and corporations as compared to the treatment of Americans as equals. And of course, the most recent laws that were passed on taxation have done the same thing, but in a greater way. And we have seen a real attack on the basic freedoms and equality of Americans, as well as other aspects of life. And I wrote about that in Our Endangered Values. in 2005, as a matter of fact. We continued our work on human rights, and back in 1999, as we faced the change of millennium in the year 2000, I was asked to make a speech in two different places, one in the Far East and another one in Norway, about the greatest challenge to human rights in the world. And at that time, I was convinced that the greatest challenge was a growing inequity in income among people, not just within individual countries like the United States and others, but also between the richest countries and the poor countries. And that was my conviction at that time. But as we got more deeply involved in the work of the Carter Center around the world and began to see the situation that exists in social affairs in different, very small countries as well as larger ones, I changed my mind. And as a result of a forum here on the basic rights of women, I decided then to write a book about women's rights and gender inequality. And I'm convinced now, and have been since that time, that the greatest violation of human rights on earth is the discrimination against women and girls. And partially because I was one of the two founders of the Carter Center originally. That had a major impact on this on our organization here, the Carter Center. So since that time, Karen and Laura and others have continued to channel a major portion of the Carter Center's work on publicizing and trying to correct this gross violation of human rights. I won't go into detail about that. You can read my book if you have to. But I outlined the major challenges to women and girls in the world, and I didn't spare the United States because we know that in our military we have, the last data I got, we had about 16,000 sexual violations, sexual crimes committed in the military itself. And in our colleges and universities, we have publicized also the fact that a girl who enters an American university, of which we're very proud, of the university and the girls, that they are faced with the potential of sexual abuse. And the inequality of treatment of girls and women in this country is mirrored in most of the countries around the world. And the Carter Center has taken that on as a major commitment to try to deal with that crisis in human rights, inequities, and so we continue to do that, and we are reaching out to many of the leaders whom you've met the last couple of days here at the Carter Center, and many of whom have attended. I have some notes here, but I've kind of continued to ignore them. One of the things that we discussed also at a subsequent time was how women can help correct, just women being elevated in decision-making processes can elevate the prohibition or reduction in warfare compared to peace, because women are naturally inclined to promote peace instead of war, since they are directly affected by it as much or more than men. And so we had a special session on that as well. Later, we were concerned about how the world was tending to lose our confidence in the basic elements of faith. And most people, maybe before we had the forum, before I wrote my book, most recent book on faith, thought that faith was basically a religious term. But we have many other kinds of faith. When we are children, we develop faith in our mothers and fathers, and then we develop faith in our brothers and sisters, and faith in our classmates, and faith in our teachers, and faith in democracy, and faith in the military. I was in the Navy for a long time. I was a submarine officer. And we developed faith in different things, and faith in freedom, faith in democracy, faith in the truth. These are things that we take for granted. And faith, and I'd say one of the most important one is faith in each other. And one of the most startling things that I've realized, although I teach Sunday school, I teach the Bible class every Sunday at home almost, I read the Bible more carefully about the verses on faith, and one of the most startling ones to me was, I happen to be a Christian, and I teach about Jesus Christ, and one of the things that Jesus said was, when I return to earth someday, which we expect, will I find faith on earth? And that's a basic element of, I think, legitimate doubt. I never did realize it until the last few years, when we've lost faith in some things that we always took for granted. We always felt, at least for those of us in most nations on earth, that faith in democracy and freedom, and faith in each other, faith in the truth, commitment to equality of treatment of other people was a basic premise not only of our great religions, Christianity and Judaism and Islam and so forth, but also was a basic element of societal interrelationships. And so out of a forum that we've had, I've written several books, and I would say that up until now, a lot of the concerns have been addressed coming out of this forum. It's been a major permanent factor on what the Carter Center establishes as a top priority. One point I want to make is that we have, this year's event is going to be devoted to ways to restore trust in democratic governance. And we're going to emphasize today economic rights and equality and so forth. So all of you know about that. You've already studied that. But we've seen on a global basis now a move away from democracy and freedom and equality of citizenship within individual countries to more domineering authoritarian figures. That's happened in the United States. It's happened in other countries around the world as well. And when it does happen in the United States, as was the case back in 15 years ago, other countries that have a tendency to do that follow along because the United States is such a powerful factor in social and political and economic events. This year, as you know, that as Peter has just said, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is 70 years old. And I think the resolution of the United Nations to protect defenders is, 15 years old? 20 years old this year. I didn't know if it's 15 or 20, but I know it's one of the things on which the Carter Center was very deeply involved, as well as establishing the special representative for human rights and the changes that have taken place. One of the things that have been of great concern to me lately is a report issued by a guy named Philip Olson. My favorite ambassador in the world when I was president was named Philip Olson. And I sent him to Australia. That's where he wanted to go, and he was a special friend of mine from Atlanta. And he had helped me be elected to the state senate and to the governorship and to the presidency. So he never had asked for anything, and I wanted a darn good personal ambassador to Australia, so I sent him down there. And this more famous Philip Olson recently is also from Australia, so that's quite a coincidence. But I read his report when it came out, and it's extremely discouraging. As you know, he's a special rapporteur for the United Nations Human Rights Council, and he's been assigned to go to the rich countries on earth to see how prevalent poverty is in the countries that are wealthy enough to eliminate poverty completely. And he issued a report recently about the United States. After he came here and was welcomed by President Trump, and he just used U.S. government statistics for his findings, and he found out that we are at or near the bottom of all countries on earth who are wealthy in dealing with various aspects of life here. One of the most generic problems that he described is that Americans have for the first time in my lifetime, and maybe that's almost history. My lifetime is 90-something years now, but anyway, we've lost hope in the future. We don't believe for the first time that our children will have a better life than we have, and that our life can be better in the future. So we've lost hope in the future. You know about income inequality. Of all the rich countries on earth, the income inequality in America is the greatest of all. And that began, as I said, primarily the year after I left the White House, when a basic tax law was passed heavily favoring the rich, and that's been the custom since that time. I have to say, mostly by Republicans, but also by Democratic presidents, to favor the corporations and the richest people to make them even more rich. So that's another serious problem. And we have in this country, in this rich country, I guess the richest on earth, we have about 40 million people who are living in poverty now, and about 18 million are living in extreme poverty. And Rosa and I grew up in a little tiny town that had an annual income of about, I'd say, less than $200 a year. And we've obviously increased our income because of increased economy and that sort of thing, but we still have the highest number of homeless people and the highest level of child mortality and a growing incidence of death in birth. And I think lately, for the first time, adult white men don't see an increase in their life expectancy. And so to have a healthy expectancy of life, we are at the bottom. These things are very disturbing to me. And I know that you have glanced over Philip Olson's statement, and I hope you'll study it quite thoroughly, those of you who are Americans in particular. And I think a lot of the things that he expressed concern about are also apply to other people. But out of this conference, I would say that the Carter Center will derive perhaps a greater effect than any that we've had so far. Rosa and I are stepping down from active leadership in the Carter Center because of our age. Both of us are more than 90 years old now. And Mary Ann and others in the Carter Center are trying to evolve a policy or program or plan for the future, kind of a strategic plan for the future. In the past, I would say that, with the exception of one notable effort, most of our interests have been overseas. But I would guess that in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, we will need to look more at the United States and problems within this country than we have in the past. And that's one of the things that I hope that you will help us evolve, is when you make your recommendations, look at the United States as well as very poor countries like we ordinarily deal with our human rights policies, and help us do that. And also be sure to help us learn how to shape our basic priorities and deal with the unchangeable principles of life. My favorite school teacher, everybody at the Carter Center has heard this many times, was Miss Julia Coleman. She taught me when I was in high school. And Miss Julia always said, we have to accommodate changing times, but we need to cling to principles that never change. And that's been kind of a guiding principle for my life. And now we are faced with changing times that directly are tending to violate the basic principles of life, the things in which we have faith. And they expressed very succinctly and I think completely by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as other social and cultural and civil and political rights that have been pursued after that. So we need to go back to those principles in the United States and other countries. And I would hope that the Carter Center in the future will concentrate more on analyzing, not all of them, of course, because we have a limited capability here at the Carter Center, but pick out a few of the key elements that are being violated most grossly, over which we think we can have some beneficial influence, and publicize those violations of faith or human rights, and take direct action in our publicity efforts and also in our direct involvement in political affairs in the future. So I see this as kind of a turning point. I hate to say this in a way, in the history of the world. We've reached kind of a lowest level, certainly in my lifetime, in the general feeling that the future can be better than the past. And we've reached a general low level also in our respect for one another. The treatment of all people created by God as equals. We have a very serious problem with minorities in this country and with immigrants as well. But that's a worldwide problem. And those are some of the basic things on which you'll be dealing this and have been dealing the last few days. And when we issue our report, I hope that we'll take the report to Washington with a few of you going up to represent this forum and meet with key members of the Congress, meet with some of the cabinet members if that's possible. We'll be getting publicity from this forum and from other efforts that I and you will make, and then follow that up with some very tangible priorities in our individual lives, everybody that you influence in your own careers, and work through the Carter Center and our human rights group here, and let's see if we can't change the world for the better. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
And now I think it's fitting that we celebrate with some music. Ladies and gentlemen.
We thank you for having us this morning.
Well, they gild their houses in preparation for the king, and they line the sidewalks with every sort of shiny thing. They will be surprised when they hear him say, take me to the alley, take me to the afflicted ones, take me to the lonely ones that somehow lost their way. Let them hear me say, I am your friend. Come to my table, rest here in my garden. You will have a pardon. Take me to the alley, take me to the afflicted ones, take me to the lonely ones that somehow lost their way. Let them hear me say, I am your friend. Come at my table, rest here in my garden. You will have a pardon. You will have a pardon. They will be surprised when they hear him say, take me to the alley, take me to the afflicted ones, take me to the lonely ones that somehow lost their way. Let them hear me say, I am your friend. Come to my table, rest here in my garden. You will have a pardon. You will have a pardon. Take me to the alley.
Take me to the alley.
Take me to the lonely one.
Take me.
Take me to the alley.
Take me.
Take
Take me.
Take me to the lonely ones.
Take
me to the alley.
Take me.
Take me. Take me. Take me. Take me. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. That was very inspiring. And now it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Laura Olson, the director of the Carter Center Human Rights Program, and of course a partner with Karen Ryan, our senior advisor for human rights and special representative for women and girls. Laura, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Peters. Whether you are here in the room or watching online, we invite you to tweet about today's sessions. Faith in freedom. I would like to introduce a special guest. Sheikh Ushuaia is the spokesperson for His Eminence, the National Chief Imam and Grand Mufti of the Republic of Ghana. Prior to retiring, Sheikh Ushuaia worked with the Ghana Education Service for over 25 years and retired from the position of the Greater Accra Regional Manager of the Islamic Education Unit, a position he held for more than 2 decades. Sheikh Ushuaia, I understand you wish to share a greeting from His Eminence, the National Chief Imam. And for everyone's, because I did it wrong myself, to use the microphones, there's a button that has a picture of a face with someone speaking. Make sure you press it and that the light is on when you're speaking. Sheikh Ushuaia.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, we give Him thanks and praises. We adore and exalt His name. He is good and holy in fullness and perfection. We ask Allah to bestow His peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad, and indeed all the prophets and all those who tread on the path of righteousness to the day of judgment. Your Excellency, President Jimmy Carter, former President of the United States of America, and his wife, Ambassador Mary Ann Peters, Carter Center CEO. I want to recognize all the special guests here, and in our language we say all protocols observed. Permit me to greet you with Islamic greetings of love, peace, and fraternity. Assalamu alaikum. Let me begin on a note of profound thanks and appreciation for the opportunity to present the message of the eminent National Chief Imam of Ghana, on whose authority I have traveled far away from Ghana to this special forum. The message I carry, which the Chief Imam wants me to register here, is that he has studied the activities of President Jimmy Carter, having left office, and has found the center of his passion to be a concern for a section of humanity that, because of the human action, have been reduced to the description of being the marginalized, the disadvantaged, the abused, and so on and so forth. And this resonates with his ideals also to guarantee respect for all humankind, appreciate the sanctity of life and the sanctity of human blood, and that all humans in the world share in this common right that everybody desires to be given. In this regard, he wants to register his appreciation and commendation for President Carter as a man, an elderly statesman of honor and integrity, whose heart overflows with respect and love for the human species across the globe. It is on this note that he appreciates the partnership that has been forged between the Carter Center and the Office of the National Chief Imam in Ghana, which is giving voice to young girls and women whose rights continue to be abused. As we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and also the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration for Human Rights Defenders, we must see the opportunity, a unique opportunity, to even renew our commitment and deepen our relentlessness to rise in opposition against all forms of human rights abuses that have given rise to the negative categorization of human section again, as I mentioned earlier on, the deprived, the marginalized, the underprivileged, the disadvantaged, who by human actions have been made to suffer some of the most horrible and dehumanizing conditions the human mind can ever imagine. This partnership, it's our hope, partnership in service and restoration of hope in faith and freedom for all humanity is something that we hope that will grow and continue to grow in depth and in levels for the benefit of all humanity. So the Chief Imam carries this message and gives a word of commendation to Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, and the Carter Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheikh Shoaib. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Radhika Balakrishnan. She's a faculty director at the Center for Women's Global Leadership and professor in Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. Her PhD is in economics. She is also commissioner for the Commission for Gender Equity, for the City of New York, and the co-chair of the Civil Society Advisory Committee for United Nations Development Program. She has published extensively on the issue we are now here to address today. Her research and advocacy work has sought to change the lens through which macroeconomic policy is interpreted and critiqued by applying international human rights norms to assess macroeconomic policy. Dr. Balakrishna.
Thank you so much. I really can't tell you what an honor it is to be here again, and with my favorite president, and and my favorite First Lady. We're living in a time of extreme inequality, as President Carter has already talked about. Oxfam's report in 2018 said that 82% of the wealth globally is in the hands of the richest 1%. What's interesting about that number is that in 2017, 42 individuals held the same wealth as half the world's population. 2017. In 2016, that number was 66. And in 2009, around the financial crisis, that number is 366. So the concentration of wealth is getting narrower and narrower every year we go on. The concentration of wealth is also taking place in the United States, not just globally. In the US, there's been an increase in inequality, one of the worst unequal societies that we've seen. One of the interesting things is from 1940s, the late 1940s to 1980, there was shared prosperity. The bottom 20% of the population increased their real income by over 100%. The middle class grew at fairly equal amounts. And the top 5% also increased by about 86%. There was shared prosperity. And then my favorite president didn't win the election in 1981, and things changed. I mean, there are consequences. And what we see from about early 1980s is an incredible increase in the concentration of income and wealth by the top 1%. The top 1%'s income went up by huge amounts, and not to be partisan, the change in the Glass-Steagall Act of 1996 increased that concentration even further. And so right before the crisis, the increase of the top 1% was about 300% from what it was in 1980. It went down, it's still around 200%, and I actually haven't seen the numbers after the last tax change, so it might even be worse in terms of the concentration of wealth. But what we've also seen is a stagnation of income of the bottom 20% and of the middle class. So you see this increase, as an economist, you always look at graphs. You see this increase in the concentration of wealth of the top 1%, but the rest are pretty stagnant and not moving, and at times going below zero. So when the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, and the rest of the economy has stagnated over the last 30 years, there are consequences to that. And globally, we see similar levels. Inequality is increasing in almost all parts of the world, and with a very, very few exceptions. Even organizations like the International Monetary Fund, not known for redistributive policies, have been warning that this level of inequality is unsustainable for the kind of economy we live in. So it's not just sort of, oh, this is bad, but it's really not sustainable. But they don't offer alternative to the existing paradigm. So you have Standards and Poor's, the IMF, all of them sort of this rallying cry that this level of inequality is unsustainable. But what's the answer to that concentration of wealth? What new paradigm are they offering us than the kind of economic policies we've seen since the 1980s? One of the consequences of this concentration of wealth is also, as President Carter's mentioned, the rise of right-wing nationalist governments, xenophobia. These are not sort of an accident, but it really is about a consequence of the kind of economic policies that we've been following in the US, in Italy, in Hungary, in the Philippines, in India. I mean, we see these rise of right-wing nationalist governments. So something is not working. So the question I have, and it seems like a simple question, but I think it's a radical question, is what's the economy for? Why do we participate in it? We all participate, we work either to change it, we buy things, we eat breakfast, we buy coffees. What is the purpose of the economy? Is it to make sure that that 1% gets more wealthy? Or is there some other purpose for the economy? And so the work that I've been doing with my colleagues is really trying to assess a normative framework for what the economy is for, right? All of economics, I mean, as an economist, economists like to pretend that we're some positivist science that's focused on data, but we all are normative. We wish for something in the world. And the work that we've been doing is to say, what if the purpose of the economy was to fulfill human rights? What would happen if we assess the economy in terms of its obligation to fulfill human rights? What do we see as a result of that policy? The policies I think about, we've already mentioned. What if we look, and I think Peter Gabriel talked about it, to fulfill human rights such as the right to health, the right to education, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to food. If these were the rights that were held as a normative framework to assess how economic policy is made, what kind of economic policy would we see? Human rights norms and standards can be that alternative, evaluative, and an ethical framework for assessing economic policy. Not just policy, but also the outcomes of those policy. Are people having the right to food? Can we look at that as a way to see if economic policy is working? We need to look at the basic principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in terms of the absolute indivisibility of rights. And so for many years, the work on economic and social rights has been sort of secondarily looked at, but the indivisibility of rights, which is at the heart of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, is critical to look at economic policymaking. And as President Carter signed both the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, which most people forget, it gives both of those covenants together give us the normative framework in which to assess economic policy. And what it gives us in terms of economic policy, it gives us a collective responsibility to ensure an individual right. And so it's critical because a lot of people criticize human rights as being too individualistic. It's not too individualistic, it's a collective responsibility, but we're making sure that that individual in all their complexity is taken care of. Again, in terms of the civil and political rights issues, we've heard over the last 3 days from the human rights defenders who are being attacked around the world why civil and political rights are very integral to the support of economic, social, and cultural rights. You cannot have one without the other. We need to remember that policy making is a political process, especially economic policy making. It's not a technocratic process. We use in our work the idea that we hope will catch on, which is TINTA, which is there is no technocratic answer, but human rights gives us an evaluative framework by which we can judge economic policy. The human rights principles of accountability, transparency, and participation is critical for economic policy making. We use it a lot in terms of civil and political rights, but not in terms of economic policy making. Using a human rights framework does not provide us a blueprint. What it does is it gives us a process by which to evaluate the economy. Many times people, especially from the human rights movement, they say, okay, you're the economist, so what does a human rights economy look like? Well, there is no answer, but what it does is it gives us a process, and it gives us a certain evaluative framework by which to judge economic policy. Human rights puts the duty bearer is the state. And the state is paradoxical. The state can deny rights, as we've seen in the last 3 days, conversations from around the world and in the United States more recently. And the power of the state can be harnessed to realize rights. And that's the aspect of economic policy making that I would like to focus on. It requires collective action to ensure accountability. Human rights requires that collective action holds the state accountable, and that this state accountability is an open-ended process that allows for ongoing discussion and deliberation. It does not say what the distributive outcomes should be, but it gives us a normative idea by which to look at what they could be. I started by talking about inequality and on income and wealth. But we also need to look at inequality in terms of, and President Carter already mentioned this, in terms of race, gender, sexuality, and all other intersections of those identities. I don't have the numbers in terms of inequality, and I would go over time, but we know that there is incredible levels of inequality based on race, gender, sexuality, and other identities, both in the United States and all around the world. The principle of non-discrimination and equality within the human rights framework is one of the really important aspects to try and tackle these issues. And the principle of non-discrimination and equality, unlike the other rights which are progressively realized, are an immediate obligation. And so we can really hold states to account when we can show that there's discriminatory policies in terms of the of economic policy. Going back to the question of what is the economy for? The economic policy that would come out of a human rights framework is an economic policy that is grounded in substantive freedoms and equality, and for realized outcomes, not just opportunities. A democratic economy also requires global coordination and governance, and the economy is no longer just to the pursuit of the growth of the economy, but really about a shared prosperity. I will stop. The democratic, what the economy for is about people's lives, but it is also about institutions and faith in institutions and the importance of institutions, mechanisms, and structures to hold policymaking accountable. Democratic economic policy makes requiring accountability, participation, and transparency to allow people to exercise their civil and political rights in support of a more just economy.
Thank you. Now it's a pleasure for me to introduce Reverend Traci Blackmon. Reverend Traci Blackmon's life's work focuses on faith-filled communal resistance to systemic injustice. Her response in Ferguson to the killing of Michael Brown resulted in national and international recognition. Under Reverend Blackmon's direction, the United Church of Christ actively engages in social and political, racial, economic, environmental, LGBTQ immigration, as well as immigration, disability, and gender injustice. She was appointed to the Ferguson Commission by Governor Jay Nixon and to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships for the White House by President Barack Obama. Reverend Blackmon.
Thank you, Laura. It is indeed my great honor and privilege to gather here today with you, President Carter and Mrs. Carter, Ambassador Peters, the wonderful staff of the Carter Center, and this amazing delegation of human rights defenders from all over the world. These past 3 days have been both encouraging and challenging. The stories of courage, strength, and commitment to the pursuit of human dignity as the divinely inherited right of every human being reminds us that we are not alone. We are not alone in our struggles, we are not alone in our fears, and we are not alone in our faith. We still believe redemption is possible, and restoration of the human spirit is within our collective reach. I have begun reading your latest book on faith, President Carter, and I am both intrigued and encouraged by your expansive exploration of faith, for both its theological relevance to people who identify with religious communities and its moral relevance for those who aspire to a higher good. In other words, everyone believes or has faith in something. I am mindful of the recent rescue of those 12 boys and their football coach after 17 days of isolation in a Thailand cave. How was it possible for this football team and their coach to survive the darkness and dampness of this cave for so long, especially when the first 10 of those days were without food or any connection to the outside world? As I read the reports of their survival and rescue, one necessary truth emerged. These boys survived because they found something and someone they absolutely believed in during this moment of crisis. One of the articles I read stated that because the boys completely trusted their coach, and because of their faith in the coach was able to lead them in the midst of crisis to the other side of panic. And on the other side of panic was hope. On the other side of crisis, there is courage. This coach did that by employing what Ted Kolditz, a retired brigadier, describes in his book, In Extremis Leadership, leadership that was rooted in 5 core principles. Inherent motivation, meaning we need leaders who don't just pump people up as much as leaders who can calm people down. Because even in the face of fear, faith must remain. He focused on outward orientation, meaning it's not all about me, but it's about everyone connected to the situation. He focused on shared risk and common life and competence and loyalty. My friends, as I have listened to stories shared among us this week, and I have borne witness to these types of skills in many of you and the sheer resolve of those who have gathered here. I have asked myself, what gives us all the courage to press on? In spite of present dangers, in spite of threats to ourselves and our families, some of us are facing more imminent dangers than others, and yet all are persevering, often at great risk to our personal well-being and that of those we love. Last month, a report by Frontline Defenders said that in 2017, there was a well-resourced and coordinated strategy of defamation, criminalization, and violence deployed to intimidate, marginalize, and silence human rights defenders. The group received reports on the murder of 312 defenders in 27 countries. So as we approach this 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we reflect on how much further we still have to go in securing basic human rights for all people, I believe it is because as people of faith, we have each found, both individually and collectively, something we believe in, something in which we have anchored ourselves, and we are able, because of that, to persevere. Faith is essential to the pursuit of human rights. And because of our faith, we persist through moments of panic and fear, because on the other side of panic, our hope still remains. Our faith perseveres in times of distress. One of the foundational truths of our faith, in all its various expressions, is the inherent value and sacredness of all people in the eyes of God. If indeed humanity begins with the very breath of God, then, my friends, there can be no greater or lesser humanity in God. If everyone is indeed equal in the eyes of God, then varied pigmentations of our skin, the spectrum of our gender expressions, our sexuality, our health, the scope of our mental and physical abilities, our ethnicities or our religious expression or geographical location or age or innate abilities are not discriminatory factors in the eyes of God. This is the priceless inheritance of faith on which our human dignity is established and maintained. If everyone is equal in the eyes of God and humankind, then everyone must be treated equitably by the nations that govern and the people that serve. If, however, the equality of humankind is denied, then the equitable treatment of humankind is imperiled. Humankind must not legislate against that which God has orchestrated. And therefore, the role of faith leaders in the pursuit of human rights is the relentless persistence of that which we believe, that all humanity has been divinely endowed with human rights, which are inclusive of the right to freedom in all of its forms and equality in dignity and rights. That we are all endowed with reason and conscience, and that we should always act toward one another in a spirit of love and compassion indicative of the divine breath that we all share. I am aware that not every faith shares my belief in God, but every faith believes in the inherent connection of humanity and calls us to a higher ground. We are living in a time of moral crisis. And while faith is by nature political, faith need not be partisan. I agree with your teacher, President Carter. You can't applaud, I have to keep my minutes. We must adjust to changing times, but we must adhere to principles that never change. In times of moral crisis, moral courage is still necessary. In times of great fear, people of great faith must still rise with deep love. We who are have anchored ourselves in something greater than ourselves, must help shepherd this nation through crisis, through peril, because we know that our faith will hold. Because we, like that Thai coach who helped those 12 boys see light in the midst of darkness, we know that on the other side of panic, there is still hope. On the other side of crisis, there is still courage. And on the other side of fear, my friends, there is still love. What does courage look like when we have so far to go? Courage must mean more than the strength to confront those who would do us harm. Courage in this moment means the will to engage those with whom we disagree. Courage must mean more than the resolve to fight. Courage must mean the determination to love. We stand in a long history of justice warriors. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who in this country resisted slavery. We stand on the shoulders of those before us who have fought for human rights, who have fought for women's rights. We stand on the shoulders of those who have fought for workers' rights and for gay rights and for the rights of the poor. And we affirm that God and not the empire has the last word in human history. There is, my friends, a higher judge than the court, a higher law than human law, a law by which all people of faith must live, and that law is love. People of faith must continue to lead with love, must continue to legislate with love, must continue to be governed by love, must continue to fight always for love. For where there is not love, there is not God. Keep fighting, my friends. I am honored to be among you this week. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. May it be so in the names, the many names of God we call. The God of the oppressed, the God of the forgotten, the God of justice, the God of love.
Thank you, Reverend Blackmon. As promised, based on our work together over these last 3 days, we have put together a statement of our discussion, reflecting our discussion, but also our recommendations. Karen and I would like to take a few minutes now to read you that statement. We will be providing it to you over the break in hard copy, and we will be having, after the break, further panels where we can discuss the matters further. I'll start. Go ahead. Restoring faith in freedom. Human rights defenders gathered at the Carter Center, working in vastly different contexts from 36 countries, all reported on the disturbing erosion of human rights across the globe. From rising political repression to growing numbers without an adequate standard of living. We stand in solidarity to reverse this trend that has derailed democracy and strained people's faith in its most trusted institutions, while also threatening basic universal human rights, including the ability to thrive, not merely survive. When peaceful human rights movements are repressed, when human rights defenders are threatened, and when 42 individuals own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world's population, we are clearly faced with a moral, political, and economic crisis. Even in the United States, the richest country on earth, the economy since the early 1980s has enriched a few, leaving the vast majority behind. Human rights defenders in the United States, like those from other countries, reported increasing attacks on political rights, including the right to protest. The answer to turning the tide lies 70 years in our past. In December 1948, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, as a common foundation for human freedom and dignity. The Cold War created an artificial ideological divide between civil and political rights on the one hand and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other. This false choice led many nations to pursue some rights while neglecting others. Today, we strongly reject that distortion of the human rights framework and call for a return to the indivisibility of rights and the ambitious, achievable vision set forth in the UDHR. Karen?
We are at a pivotal moment as we use our collective voice for all human rights. We ask our governments to measure their success against the commitments stated in the UDHR and other human rights covenants. We ask that they give priority to human rights in the allocation of resources. We also ask that they actively support the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders by creating a global infrastructure to protect human rights defenders and their families and safeguard those fleeing persecution. We ask private sector actors, as they play a vital role in building strong economies, to incorporate human rights considerations into their business practices and support innovations for wider enjoyment of human rights. Corporate entities that exert influence to undermine human rights must be held accountable by governments and their peoples. We ask international financial institutions to take an active part in the public discourse and listen to the human rights defenders and other citizens who bring indispensable perspectives and solutions. Because IFIs, international financial institutions, have a direct and immediate impact on policy decisions in the poorest countries, we ask them to reassess conditions for fiscal support so that human rights are not a casualty of economic efficiency. We ask civil society to work with human rights defenders to co-create a truly global movement with a clear vision of the world that we will build together. Religious leaders with their moral voice have a special role to play in galvanizing this movement. We will develop collaborative strategies, deepen our solidarity, and share learning. Human rights, workers' and women's rights, rights to freedom of expression, thought, and religion, rights to education, medical care, and adequate housing are indivisible, and protecting them requires that we all keep faith with the promise of democracy, with our core beliefs, and with one another.
So you will receive a copy during the break, and we would love to get your input on that as we continue the discussion in the afternoon. I'd like to make a couple announcements before we break. And the one is that, as I mentioned last night to you defenders, and the people online are hearing this for the first time, but we will have a special opportunity to have a question and answer period with President Carter at the end of the day. And what we have asked you to do is to write your questions on cards that should be out in the lobby, for those of you here in the room, and put those cards in the basket. The deadline is 3 p.m. to do that, so please make sure you don't forget to do that. At this point then, I'd like to ask if you would like to remain seated while President Carter exits, and we could go to break, and we would all return promptly at 11:40. And Mrs. Carter, so thank you.
They don't need to stay seated.
They don't need to stay seated, okay. Everyone please return promptly before 11:40 because we will start at 11:40.